go. Do a quick welcome, and let me just you can see the bottom there. We're at Matthew 25 today. Matthew 25 verses 31 to 46. I'll finish with the beginning of chapter 26, but technically we'll do that next week. Just it kind of tidies things up a bit. So we're looking at what we often refer to as the parable of the sheep and goats, and I was playing with can I come up with a more creative title than just saying sheep and goats, something like barbecued goats, because obviously the you get the goats that get condemned to eternal fire, but actually the trouble is anything like that kind of plays into preconceptions, and one of the things that's interesting and challenging in the passage we're going to look at is actually the way in which we try to articulate issues of eternal judgment. We often kind of find difficult. Some people think they don't find it difficult, but then they make it difficult for everybody else. But equally, you'll pick up. I'm very keen on us spending time in the words of Jesus, but in a way in which we fully understand and they actually shape who we are. So I want us to look at these verses seriously, which are about judgment. I would rather have Jesus judging me than anybody else. All of those sorts of things. But as we kind of go into them, we do find that actually. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm anticipating what I'm going to kind of try and draw out of the text. So let's stick with the word, shall we? So when the Son of Man comes. So remember, we've just had. Well, I say we've just had. I'm now thinking back over several weeks. Yeah, we're in the last hours of Jesus' freedom. We're into the last handful of hours as we start counting them down now. And as we've gone through that, there's been the day of controversy in the temple. Jesus has come out. There have been questions about the changeover of the ages, the ends of the age, the coming of Jesus, and so on. And so we found it's been quite a complex period because actually I think that the recording of it in the Gospels has happened before some of the events that are probably predicted by or anticipated by the words of Jesus. And so that's why sometimes they're a bit fuzzy, but you can totally see how they relate to the destruction of the temple and so on and so forth, as well as having something to say for the future. And then we've kind of moved through, which we were looking at last week, a couple of parables which we often strip out of their context. The wise and foolish virgins and the people who are trading by faith. The thing that the two they have in common is that they're waiting for the return of someone or for the arrival of someone. And so they fit within the flow that Jesus is turning the attention of his disciples to, which is in one sense the end times. And there's an interesting sort of psychological phenomena, which is in many ways civilization kind of emerges by us lifting up our perspective and seeing further than we are. If you think about all those famous old statements, like civilization is when old men plant trees under whose shade they won't sit. The concept of that is that there's something about building something that is kingdom-like, if you can put it that way, maybe earthly kingdom rather than heavenly kingdom, but anything kind of that is kingdom-like requires you to kind of fix your perspective on something beyond you. And as we saw in the minds of people who are in history who want to build incredible human kingdoms, they kind of focus on things further and further, the 1,000-year reign of the Reich, this kind of idea. That there is something about lifting the perspective and seeing what's right there in the distance. And so, of course, that theme has been kind of going on because it's been developed with what are the ends of the ages, when will destruction of the temple, when will be your coming, the coming of the Son of Man, the completion of Jesus' mission on earth, or let's say the visible completion, because obviously on the cross, he speaks the words, it's done, it's finished. But from our perspective, we see that second coming. And so this is within that flow, and so it's still going on. So when the Son of Man comes in his glory, which is part of the question that we had a few weeks ago, and all the angels are with him, and he sits on his glorious throne, and all the peoples will be gathered before him. That's been one of the other things, the transitions we've had in more than just this last week of Jesus' life, but in the last few months when Jesus relocates to Judea. We find a lot of his teaching is now focusing on thinking broader at the nations that he's being called to. There was a kind of almost a transition between what Jesus has done up in Galilee and what he does in the south is actually the discussion with the Syrophoenician woman about the appropriateness of the Syrophoenicians receiving from Jesus. And she famously talks about even the puppy dogs, even the dogs under the table, the family household pets, have to feed on the same crumbs that the children drop. And immediately following that, Jesus actually then takes a circuitous route round Galilee. Rather than going down the Jewish side, he goes down the Gentile side, comes back up. There are practical reasons for that as well as theological or ideological ones, but it's just interesting to notice. And then shortly after that, we find him in Nazareth with his family at Jewish New Year. And then they're saying, why don't you go to the feast? Why don't you go up? And at that point, it seems he relocates. And we're told that in all four of the Gospels that he relocates into Judea. And there in Judea, he's starting to now focus on the completion of his mission in Judea, but then what comes after it. So that's been kind of part of the context as Jesus is teaching his disciples. Now we're thinking about all of the peoples gathered. At the beginning of the week, Jesus has cleared the temple. Part of the clearing of the temple has been in the court of the Gentiles. In the court of the Gentiles, it's been turned over for trading. There's a kind of a play on the vision of the desire of nations, and Jesus quotes that in that kind of context. And he's going to be seen as the desire of nations in the run-up. If you're reading John's Gospel, we discover that there's Greeks coming to him and having conversations with him, and they're being introduced via Andrew and Philip, both of whom, of course, are Greek names, Jewish people with Greek names, because they're probably very conversant in Greek. So there's been this focus and shift. So to the nations, to the end times. And these are the last words that Jesus is going to... No, they're not really, because Jesus does a lot of teaching at the Last Supper. They're the last words anyway of this discourse, and this is the last kind of sermon that happens in a public space, because the Last Supper teaching, of course, happens in a private room. So there's a kind of, this is what we're culminating into. So all the peoples are now gathered before him, and he'll separate them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And there's a very kind of obvious messianic claim in the way Jesus posits it here, because when he talks about when the Son of Man comes in his glory with all his angels, he's referring back to the themes we've been covering in the last few weeks, which is his coming again. He's coming with his angels. He's talked about that in the past. He's talked about the angels coming a part of the culmination of history. Talked about them going out into the world with the dragnet and bringing people in. These are all things that he's touched on before. They're coming together, but now as they're brought, there is a shepherd sitting on the throne who is the Son of Man, and the shepherd sitting on the throne is an image of David, the shepherd, and here in that context, like a shepherd, he's separating who has the whole lot before him. He has sheep and he has goats before him. He separates one from the other, and then it says in verse 33, and in fact, the sheep. He will, in fact, set the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. So just in kind of introducing the image into this context, which clearly Jesus owns himself. He's saying, this is of me. I've got some separation to do, and there's a very clear distinction going on. And then the king will say, and so suddenly the shepherd has been promoted to the place of king, but obviously he's king because he's sitting on a throne. So he's come in as a shepherd. He sat on a throne to show he's a king, just like it's happened with David. And he says, come, those of you blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the world's foundation. And for I was starving and you gave me food to eat. It's not going to take us long to read, but to really understand this passage, we'll probably take a bit of time on. For I was starving and you gave me food to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. Naked, but you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And here we've got a list of kind of 6 examples of kind of what it means to live righteously. The Catholic Church has something called the 7 Mercies. They've added one as well. I can't remember what it is now, but it includes all of the 6 here. They're kind of exemplary things, but equally all of these things that are examples of righteousness are themselves mercies. They're acting kindly. Right the way back at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the issue of blessed are the merciful because they will receive mercy, that was something right at the beginning. See, there's a consistency kind of going on as Jesus teaches one thing to the other. So he gives these 6 examples of what it means to be merciful, to live righteously. And the righteous respond with a question. And there seems, if you like, what he's saying is in... Actually, sorry, I just want to go back because I missed something out I wanted to point. Yeah, verse 32, sorry. All the peoples will be gathered before him. A lot of translations will have the nations, and I ummed-and-ahed. I actually think I was probably going to put people groups, but I forgot to do that in the end. And all the people groups or all the nations will be gathered before him, because there is a kind of there's a sort of a shifting focus in Jesus's words, and I don't want to draw it out as if it's a criticism of Jesus. I want to draw out how sometimes the ambiguities force us to engage in a way that helps us to kind of stretch our understanding of what it is that Jesus is meaning. And one of these tensions is that we're going to start with it's all peoples or all people groups or all nations. They're groups of people. And then we're going to start looking, and Jesus talks as if they're individuals. And this plays in because obviously there's something of judgment coming into the mix. And so people have used the ambiguities to come up with their own positions, to interpret them in slightly different ways and understand them. So I have heard people who kind of almost kind of write this passage off from being about personal condemnation, etc., because there are nations involved at the beginning. But the problem with that is by the end, you've got individuals in the mix. So there's a kind of a tension between the two. So sorry, I should have said that as we went through. So the righteous then, but the reason I'm drawing this out is that there's a kind of a level of ignorance. The righteous are answering saying, Lord, when did we see you starving and feed you? Because these aren't necessarily the religious, they're the righteous. See, the religious, if they got the right religion, they know what they're supposed to do. But whether they do it or not, that's another matter. But these are the righteous. So the righteous will answer, Lord, when did we see you starving and fed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when then did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? So all of the 6 are responded to again. But the king will respond to them, certainly I tell you, inasmuch as you acted for one of these classes of people, the least of my brothers, which means that there's an identification with the shepherd king, so someone who's come from an ordinary background, a normal human working kind of background. I have to live in the mix of, I have to work for a living. They've sat on a throne, they've become king, they've stepped into that place, but he still identifies with everybody. So inasmuch as you acted towards the least of these, my brothers, you did it for me. So we're very familiar with the words, but as I say, that's because we might be or may not be righteous, but we are probably religious. So we know the religious answer. We know that we're supposed to do those things, And I just this week, I sent a letter back to the child we support through Compassion. We all know that we're supposed to do these things because they're the right thing, but people are kind of asking almost in that question of when, which in Jesus's context is a real challenge. It's stretching people to understand, and it's a key kind of part of the Christian message, which is that as I see the image of God, I see therefore Christ in the individuals that I see around me. And it's not just because they're virtuous, it's because they carry God's image, and I honour that image in them. Then actually there is a sense in which that is being understood in the mind of God, in the heart of God, as actually how we treat him. Which of course is such an incredibly radical idea, this kind of concept, which makes I'm just trying to remember who it was. I heard someone who you wouldn't think of as a Christian. They were a public figure, talking about the foundation of human rights is the understanding of the image of God in individuals, and if you take that away, you end up with no foundation for human rights. So, and this is not my opinion. I'm just trying to remember who it was who I heard saying it. It was kind of a news presenter or someone, or kind of putting it in those ways. But here we find it blended into this teaching as Jesus is focusing on the end times and inevitably an element of judgment, as we're going to see. Then he will also say to those who are now on his left, "Depart from me, you who are condemned." I think the word, we often will see it translated as cursed, but it's not that they were it's an eternal cursing. There's a condemnation that we're going to find is related to the judgment, which is not because of no reason. It's because there is actually evidence for it, if we put it that way. Those of you who are condemned into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Now, when I knew we were going to be doing this passage, it was one of those things where I always kind of have a, oh no, because people have very strong ideas on how judgment and heaven and hell work. And the thing as I've looked at these things more and more, I know there is judgment, there is a place of destruction, which we got here in eternal fire. There is, not everybody makes it into the afterlife. I'm not a universalist. I do believe in all of these things, and yet the details of people get very, very strong on particular interpretations and particular standing on positions. And when I look at them, I've never been able to untangle all of them. If I give you an example, I had a quick look because I knew we were doing the passage to get my head around things. And I read the first article I read did lots of the things which I've regularly seen people do, which is they bring an assumption which is based on how they understand things, and they impose it on the text, and they impose it in such a way that they can't even see that anybody would think something different. So, for instance, and I don't know why this is, whenever I read eternal fire, I don't read eternal conscious torment. That's so in other words, that's the judgment that the people are put into is in a place which is an eternal punishment, in the sense of I have an eternal, that we find the phrase in the New Testament, eternal salvation as well. But salvation is something that has happened to me once, and I live in the consequence of it. So an eternal punishment happens to me, and then the consequences are eternal. They live forever. And that's always been part of the tension as to how we read it. So some people read this and see, if you like, a continuous conscious punishment going on that is actively lived through. And as I say, I'm not saying that they can't see it that way. I'm just saying that they can't see how someone could see something slightly differently. And there are more than that, because, for instance, as I read through the same article of the person I was looking at, they're talking it's internal fire. It's always going to be fire. That's what the judgment is like. And then in the quotes that he's then throwing out there, he throws in a quote from Jude, where the eternal punishment actually in this context is darkness and separation from God. And so here he is making a big thing of it's always conscious, there's something about the burning of it. But then there's another verse that's also about eternal, has the eternal word in it, but there it's called eternal darkness and separation from God in Jude. And this has always been the kind of the problem, is you've got these various analogies that Jesus uses, and when we treat each analogy as an absolute for eternity and we lock them in, we often end up creating contradictions with other parts of Scripture. And the way I try and understand these things is I like, at the beginning of John, I find it really helpful when we have the well-known statement about being born again in the beginning of John with Nicodemus. And as that conversation goes on, Jesus says something very interesting. He says, you as a teacher of Israel don't understand these things. And he says, we're talking, and they're although it doesn't have exactly this phrase, but the context is we're talking about kind of the heavenly realms. So we're talking about the heavenly realms, but we're talking with natural images, with things that we can see. So things So I'm communicating with you, Nicodemus, and you're a teacher in Israel. I'm communicating to you things that are about heaven, but I'm giving you examples that are earthly. So when I talk about being born again, I'm not physically saying go into the mother's womb, come out again, and so on. We're trying by analogy to get at something which we perceive in the spirit, but we don't see with the clarity that we know the physical world, because we've been given a physical body with physical eyes. We learn our lessons through the physical, and then we try and understand the spiritual in those senses. And so he says, we talk about things we see and we understand. Supposing I tried to speak to you about spiritual things with spiritual images. And it's the kind of the tension is that it would be difficult for you to really get your head around it. And I think that actually part of that is part of the mix here, as we and why I'm always cautious about becoming too dogmatic about how something works, because you will regularly find this tension. Darkness, or is it fire? Well, fire tends to have light. And another thing that I've found, particularly when we're coming to this issue of judgment, so I believe in judgment. I suspect that it's not eternally conscious. I suspect that's why in Revelation, when sinners go into the lake of fire that was prepared, which is reference here for the devil and his angels, it's for them it's called a second death. It's not a second death for the angelic, if you like. For the angelic, it's in eternal punishment. For humanity, because there are verses elsewhere that talk about immortality having to be shared by God and so on. That only God is immortal, in both directions, so on and so forth. But in that context in Revelation, the experience of going into the eternal fire, the fire that is eternal, isn't necessarily eternal in the consciousness of the person who goes into it, and which is why I think it is referred to, therefore, in Revelation as the second death. It is a punishment. It's not pleasant. And so on, and we have to face that as we're promoting, because Jesus is in his balance of grace and truth, make sure he doesn't avoid the unpleasant things that are consequences of kind of a sense of moral integrity in who God is, in the way he's made the world, with the benefits he's given us, but therefore the responsibilities for the misuse of them. So again, I'm giving you the images I find helpful to understand these things. So over the years, lots of people look at these things and try and work out, so how does eternal reward and eternal punishment work for individuals? And they come up with their theories. There are good ones and there are bad ones. There are various ones I like. I like C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. But I don't think that it's literally the way that C.S. Lewis describes it. But it helps me as I'm trying to find earthly images to describe something that is a real, serious, eternal truth that we have to face. I find it a helpful kind of model, for instance. And so one of the models I think is if you think about creation, because I think there's something about our eternal destiny which is also tied up in the kind of concept of creation. So God speaks. So in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. So he's created the sphere of the earth. And God speaks and says, let there be light. So fire actually is something that produces light. There's light. Where there's fire, there is light. There's something that God has put in. So there's something, but it's also heat. And you get that in Genesis as well, because, you get motion, you get energy, you get so the spirit of the Lord, the breath of the Lord is life, is in moving over the surface of the deep. Movement requires energy, so there's something of light and there's energy. And again, going back to C.S. Lewis in the creation story in the Narnia books, he has Diggory and Polly, is it Polly in The Magician's Nephew, who are there in the dark, and then God in Aslan is going to create, and he starts singing, and there's an explosion of light. And in science we think of that this explosion of light and fire, if you like. We call it the Big Bang, where the creation starts with this enormous bang. And there's something, if you like, as human life emerges, it emerges as there is space made within this burning kind of truth of energy and fire that emerges in the spaces that creates, as that kind of almost as that cools down. And so this is just me thinking. There's something about eternity which is back with all of just when God speaks at the beginning into the nothingness. There's fire and there's energy in it, but that's too much for us in our humanity to cope with. Our humanity almost requires space within things to have cooled down a little bit. And so there's something consequential almost in the return to God, that we're back like we were in the foundations, which is there's so much of the energy and everything else that is not in line with the purposes of God can't stand it. It gets shredded, it gets destroyed, it gets punished. It's not a pleasant experience. But of course, Jesus is trying to speak, and so theologians refer to it as the condescension of God. That right the way through Scripture, God has had to speak about things to do with eternity in terms of what's available to the humanity that he's speaking to. And in the ancient world, there were less things, there were less models they have than we have today. So spiritual people, as they've read things that were written in a handful of words with a handful of experiences in the Old Testament, have extrapolated from that and retell those things with modern language. A good example of that would be again in Genesis, where in the same verse we'll find the word shamayim, the heavens, but sometimes it's translated the sky, sometimes it's the gap between heaven and earth, sometimes it is the heavens in terms of where the stars are, and sometimes it's heaven where God is. The same word, you see, it's just one word, but we had all those possibilities. In English, we can distinguish them. So we can refer to the expanse with the stars, we can refer to the sky with its blue, and we can refer to heaven because we want to say that's where God is, you see. So we're doing that. We're trying to take the condescension that God has met us on our level. He has given us models that teach us something, that give us some sort of a feel, and we have that coming out here. I'm neither wanting to kind of give the impression, because I think it's dishonest to the testimony of Jesus, that punishment is not real and it's all easy, and at the same time recognize that even in the words Jesus uses, he uses kind of messages, he uses models and images that we could see as contradicting, and even we could come at like Nicodemus and go, what on earth are you talking about being born again? But what Jesus is doing is he is speaking to us things that are beyond our experience, but to leave within us an emotional impression that imposes on us the priority and importance of what he's trying to say. So to really understand that this is a key issue, and here very often those who are strongest on wanting to make a big thing of it being eternal fire, they miss the fact that actually faith in Jesus has produced a response of action, not just a thought. That actually our faith is made known by our actions, by our works, as James puts it. Not that we have been saved by them, but our faith is expressed because something has shifted in us and changed in us. And so Jesus actually used that in the contrast in that you acted or didn't act to the least of these. So verse 44, while they this is now then he'll also say to those on his left, depart from me, who are condemned to eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I hungered, but you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, but you did not take me in. Naked, and you will not clothe me. Sick and in prison, you did not visit me. So we haven't learnt that our faith that we have put into Jesus and what he has accomplished on the cross, when we say we have faith in it, we mean I give intellectual assent to it, and as Paul puts it. Even the devils do that. There's something much more that it means to have put our faith in those things. So while they will also respond, Lord, when did we see you hungry, thirsty, or a stranger? And sorry, I'll quickly go back to what I just said, our failure day to day to live up to some of the things we ought to be doesn't therefore neither does that fully disqualify us. It is much more that our faith in what we say of Jesus is working its way into us. As Jesus puts it, if you abide in my words, then you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You really come into that discipleship journey by taking time with his words. But by the time we get to John 15, if you abide in me and my words now abide in you, the things he's taught have now become a part of my emotional, spiritual identity in who I am. So I started by taking time to try and wrestle with them, understand them. They've now somehow got into me, and by getting into me, they have affected the way I live and the way I treat people and the way I behave. So you can really sort of see those things. So if they've now got into you, in that case, if you're in that place, then ask what you will of the Father, and it will be done for you in this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. There's that journey that we're drawn into by our response to the word of Jesus, which is by faith. We're responding to it by faith, but faith isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's an exercise that actually internalizes and produces a change in our actions. And here, we're not therefore wanting to get too much into the dynamics, exactly what punishment and reward look like, but we see in the terms of the story as Jesus is telling it, and he's not really in a parable mode now, he is in a slightly different place, because he's clearly kind of taking images which he sees and understands of himself. And so he'll answer them now saying, certainly, inasmuch as you didn't act for one of these, the least of my brothers, you didn't do it for me. Jesus wants that faith. As he's talked about time and time again, there are those who've performed miracles in my name and done other things in my name, but I didn't know you. And these are people who say they know me, and at one level kind of perhaps feel they do because they know the religious answers, but it hasn't produced any change in them. And so the question is it really there? They're going away into eternal punishment. I'm laughing. That's not a thing to laugh at, is it? Eternal punishment. I.e. a punishment which has an eternal consequence. But the righteous into an eternal life. And of course, that's where the chapter finishes. So there's the wider group now. They are all disciples, but they're the wider group of disciples who've gathered around Jesus, more than the 12, more than the 70. This is the wider group of people who are tagging along with Jesus at the end of his ministry through Judea. And so he's speaking to those, and he leaves them with this very sobering and kind of words to internalize, to understand, to allow it to challenge them to a level of life and activity once the resurrection has happened that is more than just mental assent and not being unkind to people. It's actually actively changing the world, and recognizing the weight of the decisions that they're involved in, and what they do and don't do, and how they withhold what they could do or do things that they shouldn't do. Those have big consequences, which Jesus wants to get across. So the chapter ends there, but I'll just give it the last couple of verses. So it happened that when Jesus finished all these words, and he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover starts, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to be crucified. And there's a transition, so we'll revisit these verses next week. But I just wanted to put that the teaching is now concluded. And this passage, along with several others, you will sometimes hear as I'm teaching that I don't always find them easy to teach from, but I'm really grateful to read them, because what I've found in me, it creates a kind of a spiritual tension and knowledge within me that I can't always find easy to say exactly how things are without either feeling like that those words feel too cruel for Jesus, but equally they are Jesus's words, and so there's something here that I need to subject myself to understand this. And when I get hold of it, I recognize somehow it produces in me a sense of energy and urgency that does actually motivate me to act. Final word, which is kind of a secular word now. I therefore found it quite helpful when I was used to do the kind of psychological teaching of people, stuff and development stuff, was finding there is a very well understood principle that you primarily motivate people with positive words, with positive ideas. However, if there is no what they sometimes in what they call game theory, if there's no black-hatted motivation, i.e. something that's I'll lose something, I won't get that, there'll be punishment, that kind of thing. If there is none of that, people don't act. They go, oh, that's really nice, I'll become really passive. So there's a sale on and I can buy a half-price sofa. We need a sofa, but the sale's on. No need to rush today. We can do it in 3 years' time. If you don't have ending on Saturday, people don't act, you see. That's a simple example. But more generally, the principle is that the majority of the message has to be positive. But if you don't actually draw attention to the fact that there are consequences negatively, then you won't. Then people just don't do anything, and so I understand in the kind of the mix actually, because I know it in my own heart that I could be very passive. Isn't God good? Isn't it amazing? Everything all worked out. He's taken full responsibility, but actually I want to take seriously the words of Jesus, and as I take them seriously, while I can't always tell you that I fully understand exactly what they meant, and part of that is probably because we're using earthly imagery to speak about something that happens in an eternal context, where things will probably are very different, but at the same time are related to what's physical, to what we know now. I'm not brilliant at always describing them with great precision and detail, and I would rather sit in that slightly fuzzy place, but express the gospel, than feel I've got it all tied down and then actually deeply, secretly being embarrassed by what I think I believe and therefore not saying anything, or so convincing myself that even though I don't like what I'm saying, that this is exactly the way it has to be, that actually you end up spoiling what you're trying to achieve, because you impose something that's too harsh, and you yourself become a bad messenger. So that's my confession for the week. But as I say, I genuinely am, and I've deliberately chosen within King's Church that we're going to look at some of these harder passages, because I do think they're important to us, if you like, maintaining the life and the motivation and integrity, as we sometimes face the things and don't try and say these are too easy, because that's really just the religious view of ourselves winning. Because actually some of the things we will find hard and difficult, but there are ways, as we think through them, of understanding them in ways where we see, okay, I see why this is not just, if you like, capricious meanness from God. This is a consequence of something to do with the way that creation is made, and the way in which the world has been put together. And while I can't fully get my head around always why that would have to be the case, I kind of can feel the truth of it. So I, as I say, it may not be a good answer if there's a Richard Dawkins asking me for how these things work, but you do know that there are real consequences, because life matters. Sorry, I'm trying to find a good way of describing what I feel. I saw a thing recently where, because I think this is sort of relevant, where Richard Dawkins was going on and on about why would a God who's made this incredible, if you think about how big the universe is and how many planets there are and how many creatures there might be on the planets, and the idea that God is interested in what you do with your genitals is just ludicrous, he's saying, you see. And I was thinking about what he's saying, because it kind of resonates in the modern world, where we are taught about the bigness of the universe in school, but equally in school we're also taught that, what you choose to do sexually is up to you, you see. So why would that matter? So it matters to the modern heart. And I was trying to think, so what's a good answer to the point he's making? And the way I thought about it was, I thought, well, the thing is, we live in a non-material world. We live in a physical world, but actually our thoughts and ideas, and when I imagine the universe, all of that is mental. That's not a physical thing. And yet here's the thing, the idea of civilization, which we talked at the beginning, that idea of life beyond myself, considerably beyond myself. Do I live for life that's considerably beyond myself or not? that idea I heard somebody once describe as it's when the male sexual libido is made subject to the reproductive cycle of the woman. And there's that kind of idea that actually civilization emerges when men learn that it's not just about the pleasure of pursuing their libido, but it is that pleasure has to come into a context where something matters beyond themselves, i.e. the care of the mother, the care of a child who is a future, who will themselves become a rounded individual to raise rounded individual future children, which will build layer on layer, and civilization emerges, you see. And so there is something, if you like, in which I have to recognize that sometimes God's perspective feels like, why does this matter as much as it does? But he can see the consequences of beyond where I can always, and he's given them to me by grace, so that they can receive those things by grace, even if I don't fully understand why, so that I can embed those things into who I am. So that's probably, I need to stop at this stage and give place for questions if anyone would like to ask anything.